The heavy mahogany doors of the Zhao estate in New York didn't just close, they slammed with a finality that echoed through the rain-slicked driveway, leaving Sienna Vance standing in a threadbare maid's uniform as her divorce papers fluttered into a muddy puddle.
I'm coming for everything.
Inside, the man she had loved for 3 years, Kian Zhao, stood silent while his mother laughed, calling Sienna low-class trash, who should be grateful she even tasted their world for as long as she did. But they didn't know that the woman they just discarded like a used rag was the sole heiress to the sterling global fortune, a woman whose father owned the very ground they walked on and the air they breathed. If you want to see the most satisfying revenge in history as a billionaire realizes he just divorced a queen, subscribe now and hit the bell because you won't believe what happens when the sun rises. Sienna didn't cry as the cold Manhattan wind bit into her skin, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering streetlights with a lethal, shimmering calm that would have terrified Kian if he had the courage to look at her one last time. For 3 years, she had hidden her identity, playing the role of the humble orphan maid to see if Kian loved the woman or the wealth, only to find out that his heart was as hollow as the golden cage he lived in. She reached into the hidden pocket of her apron and pulled out an encrypted satellite phone that hadn't been turned on in 1,000 days, her thumb hovering over the only contact labeled father. The call connected on the first ring, a deep, commanding voice from the District of Columbia answering with a mixture of relief and raw power that could shake the stock market. "It's over, Dad," Sienna whispered, her voice a silk-wrapped blade that cut through the noise of the city. "The Zhaos think I'm nothing, so I want you to give me 24 hours to show them exactly what nothing can buy in this town." On the other end of the line, Silas Sterling, a man who controlled more assets than the Federal Reserve, didn't ask questions. He simply gave the order that set a fleet of black helicopters into the sky from Connecticut to Washington. Within minutes, a line of sleek, armored SUVs with tinted windows turned onto the private drive, their headlights blinding Kian's mother as she watched from the balcony, her sneer frozen in confusion. Sienna didn't look back at the mansion as a man in a $5,000 suit stepped out and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the asphalt. "Welcome home, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice carrying to the open windows where Kian stood, the name, Sterling, hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. Sienna stepped into the vehicle, the door closing with a soft, expensive thud that sounded like the lid of a coffin for the Zhao family's future. But that was only the beginning of the nightmare for Kian. What Sienna did next changed the landscape of New York real estate forever, proving that the woman they kicked out was the only thing keeping them from total annihilation. Kian Zhao sat in his glass-walled office on the 80th floor of the Zhao Tower, the morning sun over Manhattan failing to warm the sudden, unexplained chill that had settled in his bones since the night before. His mother, Madame Zhao, was already pacing the Persian rug, her voice a shrill symphony of greed as she discussed the merger with the Sterling Group that was supposed to save their failing shipping empire. "Forget that girl, Kian," she snapped, her jewelry rattling like dry bones. "By noon, we will be partners with the richest family in the world, and you will be engaged to a woman who actually brings something to the table." Kian tried to focus on the documents, but the way Sienna had looked at him in the rain, with pity, not pain, kept playing on a loop in his mind, making him feel smaller than he ever had in his life. Suddenly, the double doors to the boardroom burst open, and his lead counsel, a man usually as unshakable as a mountain, stumbled in with a face the color of bleached bone. "The merger is dead, sir," the lawyer gasped, clutching a tablet that showed the Zhao global stock price plummeting in a vertical red line that looked like a heart monitor flatlining. "Worse than that, someone just executed a hostile takeover of our primary debt holders in Connecticut and Massachusetts. We don't own this building anymore." Kian stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes fixed on the television screen as a news anchor announced a sudden change in leadership at Sterling Global. The doors to the executive elevator chimed, and a woman stepped out, surrounded by a phalanx of security guards in tactical gear, her presence radiating a cold, celestial authority that made the air in the room vanish. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform anymore, she was draped in a custom-tailored white silk suit that contrasted beautifully with her deep mahogany skin, her hair a crown of regal, perfectly coiled natural curls. Kian's mother let out a strangled sound, her hand flying to her throat as she recognized the low-class girl she had thrown onto the street just 12 hours ago. Sienna walked to the head of the boardroom table, her heels clicking with the rhythmic precision of a firing squad, and she didn't wait for an invitation to sit in Kian's chair. "Good morning, Kian," she said, her voice smooth and dangerous, a sharp contrast to the trembling silence of the room. "I believe you're familiar with the terms of your lease, and since you're currently 3 minutes into an uncured default, I'm here to collect the keys." Kian couldn't speak, his brain refusing to reconcile the humble woman who used to make his tea with the goddess of industry currently dismantling his life with a single glance. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a wife, he had insulted the most powerful woman in the Western Hemisphere, and she wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to finish the job. The air in the boardroom turned to liquid lead as Madame Zhao finally found her voice, though it came out as a shrill, desperate screech that bounced off the soundproof glass. "This is a trick. You're a maid, a nobody from the streets of Washington who tricked my son into a pity marriage," she screamed, her face contorting into a mask of ugly disbelief while she pointed a shaking finger at Sienna's flawless white suit. Sienna didn't even blink, she simply tilted her head, a small, cold smile playing on her lips as she signaled her assistant to place a thick leather binder on the table. "Actually, Madame Zhao, I am the daughter of the man who holds the mortgage on your Hamptons estate, your Connecticut vineyard, and this very building," Sienna said, her voice dropping to a silk-wrapped whisper that made Kian's knees buckle. She opened the binder to reveal the original deed to the Zhao family mansion, now stamped with the bold, scarlet seal of Sterling Global, showing that the transfer had been finalized at exactly 4 o'clock that morning. Kian stepped forward, his eyes searching Sienna's face for a trace of the woman who used to wait for him with a warm smile and a kind word, but he found only the reflection of his own failure. "Sienna, please, we can talk about this. I didn't know, I was pressured," he stammered, his voice thin and pathetic compared to the resonant power vibrating from her. Sienna stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket with a deliberate, slow grace that commanded the attention of every person in the room. "You knew enough to stand silent while your mother threw my belongings into the mud, Kian," she replied, her words cutting through his excuses like a diamond-tipped blade. "You knew enough to sign those divorce papers without even looking me in the eye, believing I was beneath your status." She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the New York skyline with the eyes of a conqueror who had just returned to her rightful throne. "But that was only the beginning of your debt." She turned back to face them, her expression shifting into something even more lethal as she pulled a second document from the folder. "I've spent the last 3 hours reviewing the books of Zhao Global, and it seems someone has been funneling company funds into a private account in the Cayman Islands to cover a gambling debt in California." Kian's mother froze, the blood draining from her lips as she realized the maid hadn't just been cleaning their floors, she had been observing their rot. "That's confidential," Madame Zhao hissed, but Sienna merely laughed, a sound as bright and terrifying as a lightning strike. "Nothing is confidential from the owner of the company, and as of 5 minutes ago, I am the chairman of the board." She leaned over the table, her face inches from Kian's, her gaze burning with a fire that had been stoked by 3 years of silent endurance. "You wanted a wife with status, Kian, and now you have the privilege of being the first person I fire for my new acquisition." The security guards moved forward, their shadows stretching across the polished floor as they waited for Sienna's signal to remove the former royals from the palace. Kian looked at his mother, then back at Sienna, the weight of his choice finally crushing the life out of his pride. He realized he had traded a diamond for a piece of glass, and the diamond was about to shatter his world into a million jagged pieces. "Silas is waiting downstairs in the lobby," Sienna added, referring to her father with a casualness that made Madame Zhao gasp. "He wants to see the faces of the people who thought a sterling wasn't high-class enough for their crumbling dynasty." But as the guards gripped Kian's arms, his phone buzzed with an alert that made his eyes go wide with a new kind of terror. What he saw on the screen changed the stakes of their war forever, revealing a secret Sienna hadn't even discovered yet. The screen of Kian's phone didn't just flash, it pulsed with a crimson alert from the New York Bureau of Records, a notification so severe it bypassed his silent mode and let out a piercing, high-pitched chime that cut through the tension like a siren. His mother was still screaming at the guards, her voice a jagged melody of classist insults, but Kian's eyes were glued to the text that revealed the divorce papers he had handed Sienna in the rain were officially flagged as fraudulent. A cold sweat broke across his brow as he realized that in her desperation to get rid of the maid, his mother hadn't waited for Sienna to sign anything. She had used a sophisticated AI forgery to mimic Sienna's signature weeks ago, accidentally triggering a spousal protection clause in the Sterling family's master trust. Because the divorce was filed under false pretenses and forgery, the law didn't just void the separation, it activated a dormant betrayal penalty that transferred 50% of Kian's personal offshore accounts and his family's private Connecticut estate directly to Sienna as restitution. Kian looked up at Sienna, who was watching him with a calm, predatory patience, her arms crossed over her white silk blazer as she waited for the weight of the realization to crush him. "You didn't just kick me out, Kian," Sienna said, her voice a low, lethal hum that vibrated through the floorboards. "You tried to steal the identity of a woman who owns the very clouds above this city, and now, thanks to your mother's greed, you've legally handed me the keys to your personal life, too." Madame Zhao stopped screaming, her face turning a sickly shade of gray as she saw the alert on Kian's screen, the realization dawning on her that her shortcut had just become a high-speed rail to their total ruin. The boardroom doors swung open again, but this time it wasn't security. It was a team of investigators from the New York District Attorney's Office, their badges gleaming under the bright LED lights as they moved toward Madame Zhao with a clinical, terrifying focus. "Madame Zhao, you are under arrest for first-degree forgery, identity theft, and corporate fraud," the lead officer stated, his voice booming in the silent room. Kian reached out for Sienna, his hand trembling as he tried to grasp the hem of her jacket, his voice a broken, pathetic whimpering of the woman's name he had once called his wife. Sienna didn't move, she didn't flinch, she simply looked down at his hand as if it were a stain on her pristine white suit that she couldn't wait to bleach away. "I spent 3 years playing the role of the submissive wife, watching you look through me as if I were made of glass," Sienna whispered, the emotion finally bleeding into her voice, a raw, powerful hurt that made the air in the room feel thin. "I wanted to see if there was a man of honor beneath that Zhao name, but all I found was a coward who let his mother do his dirty work." She signaled to the officers, and as they clicked the handcuffs around Madame Zhao's wrists, the sounds of his mother's frantic pleas became the background music to Kian's final descent into nothingness. He was losing his company, his home, his mother's freedom, and the only woman who had ever truly loved him, all in the span of a single New York morning. But as the police led his mother away, she turned and shouted one final, desperate secret that made the investigators freeze and Sienna's heart stop for the first time in the entire ordeal. What she screamed changed the context of the last 3 years, revealing that Kian wasn't the only one with a hidden agenda. The air in the boardroom shattered like dropped crystal as Madame Zhao's final, desperate scream echoed off the glass. "He knew, Sienna. Kian didn't marry you for love. He married you because he found your father's tracking chip in your locket a year ago and thought he could use you as a bargaining chip." The words hit Sienna like a physical blow, more painful than any insult about her class or her skin ever could be, and she felt the ground beneath her designer heels turn to quicksand as she looked at Kian, her breath catching in a jagged, hollow sob. Kian flinched, his sharp Korean features contorting in a mask of such profound guilt that the truth was written in every line of his face, his obsidian eyes refusing to meet her mahogany-brown gaze as the silence in the room became a living, breathing monster. Sienna stepped back, her hand flying to the gold locket she had worn every single day, the only piece of her former life she had kept, realizing that the man who had whispered, "I love you," in the dark had been calculatedly monitoring her value to his family's survival. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to snap under the weight of his silence, the white silk of her suit suddenly feeling like a shroud of her own making. Kian dropped to his knees, not in a plea for mercy, but as a man who had finally been crushed by the weight of his own double life, his voice a low, broken rasp that barely carried across the polished floor. "I found the chip, Sienna, but I didn't tell my mother because I knew she'd use you, so I kept you hidden in that maid's uniform to protect you from the very people currently taking her away in handcuffs." The revelation didn't bring comfort, it only added a new layer of betrayal, the realization that Kian had treated her like a piece of property to be guarded rather than a woman to be loved, his protection being just another form of imprisonment. You kept me as a servant in your own home to protect me? Sienna's voice rose, a sharp, cinematic resonance filling the room as she looked at the man she had called her husband, her eyes burning with a fire that made the investigators pause at the door. You let your mother humiliate me, you let her treat me like low-class trash for 3 years, all while you sat on the secret of who I really was just to keep me under your thumb. Kian reached out, his fingers brushing the hem of her trousers, but Sienna stepped away as if his touch were poison, her expression hardening into a look of such absolute, regal coldness that the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. At that moment, the boardroom doors chimed and a man walked in who made the DA investigators stand at attention, Silas Sterling, the architect of the Sterling Empire, his presence a dark, overwhelming force that eclipsed everyone else in the room. He didn't look at Kian, he didn't look at the police, he walked straight to Sienna and placed a heavy, protective hand on her shoulder, his icy blue eyes fixed on the man on the floor. I've been watching you, Kian Zhao, Silas said, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that felt like thunder before a storm. I knew you found the chip, and I waited to see if you would be man enough to tell my daughter the truth or if you would continue to play this pathetic game of charades. Kian looked up, his face a map of pure, unadulterated terror, realizing that while he thought he was playing a game with Sienna, Silas Sterling had been the one holding the controller the entire time. Silas pulled a single file from his briefcase and dropped it onto the table, the sound echoing like a gavel in a death row trial. You didn't just hide her, Kian, you used the Sterling chip to access our private servers in Washington and Connecticut to keep your shipping firm afloat for 2 years. Sienna's world tilted again, the betrayal deepening as she realized Kian's love was built on a foundation of corporate espionage and theft, his entire marriage a long-form heist of her family's legacy. She looked from her father to her husband, feeling like a pawn in a war between two giants, but as she reached for the file, a secondary notification on Silas's phone caught her eye, a live video feed from her father's security team at the Zhao mansion. What she saw on the screen made the blood in her veins turn to liquid nitrogen, revealing a hidden room in the Zhao basement that contained something neither she nor Kian was ever supposed to find. But that was only the beginning of the horror. What she saw next changed her entire perspective on her father, proving that the man who claimed to be her savior might be the most dangerous villain of them all. The digital feed on Silas Sterling's phone didn't just show a room, it revealed a sanctuary of cold, calculated betrayal that made the air in the New York boardroom turn into shards of dry ice, the images flickering with a clarity that dismantled Sienna's world for the 3rd time in a single morning. The hidden basement in the Zhao mansion was lined with high-definition monitors and stacks of surveillance logs, every single one of them dated from the very first night she had met Kian in a rain-drenched park in Washington, proving that her chance encounter with the Korean heir had been a scripted event orchestrated by her own father. Sienna watched in a hollow, terrifying silence as the feed zoomed in on a contract signed by Silas Sterling and Kian's father 5 years ago, a merger of blood that had used Sienna as a literal Trojan horse to infiltrate the Zhao infrastructure, her father having leaked the location of her tracking chip to Kian intentionally just to see if the boy would take the bait. Kian let out a strangled, broken sound from the floor, his eyes fixed on the screen as he realized he wasn't the hunter, but a pawn in a much larger, more vicious game being played by the man he had once feared. Sienna turned toward her father, the white silk of her suit shimmering under the harsh office lights like the wings of a vengeful angel, her mahogany brown eyes burning with a fire that finally eclipsed the sterling blue of her father's gaze. You didn't just watch me, Dad, she whispered, her voice a low, lethal resonance that made the DA investigators back away toward the door. You engineered 3 years of my humiliation, you let me live as a servant, just so you could have a front-row seat to the destruction of your rival. Silas didn't flinch, he didn't apologize, he stood there with the cold, immovable arrogance of a man who believed he owned the souls of everyone in his bloodline. I made you a queen, Sienna, he replied, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that lacked even a spark of remorse. I gave you the ultimate test, and look at you now, you own the Zhao Empire and you've learned that in this world, Love is a liability and power is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. Sienna let out a laugh, a sharp, cinematic sound of pure, unadulterated liberation that echoed through the glass halls of the tower, and she reached out, snatching the master tablet from her father's hand before he could react. With a series of rapid, precise taps she had learned while cleaning the Zhao servers, she activated a dormant ethical breach protocol she had coded herself months ago, a digital guillotine that didn't just target the Zhaos, but the sterling global board of directors as well. "You're right about one thing, Dad," Sienna said, her voice dropping to a silk-wrapped blade that felt like a death sentence. "Power is the only currency, and as of this second, I've triggered a vote of no confidence against you for using corporate assets to facilitate the kidnapping and surveillance of a sterling heir." Silas's face turned a shade of gray that matched the Manhattan smog, his phone suddenly exploding with alerts as his own board members began to turn on him like a pack of hungry wolves. Kian looked up at Sienna, a flicker of hope in his obsidian eyes, but she looked down at him with a pity that was more devastating than any hatred. "And you, Kian," she said, her voice steady and final. "You had 1,000 chances to choose me over your family's greed, but you chose to be a spectator in my pain." She signaled to the security team, the men who had once bowed to Silas and Kian, and with a single, regal nod, she watched as they moved to escort both her father and her husband out of the building. The power of the Sterling Zhao merger was now concentrated in the hands of the woman they had both tried to use, a $900 billion empire built on the back of a Maid who had finally stopped playing her part. Sienna walked back to the head of the table, sitting in the high-backed leather chair as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating her in a golden glow that made her look like the goddess of justice she had become. Silas was led away in a stunned silence, his legacy crumbling with every step, and Kian was left with nothing but the divorce papers Sienna had finally signed, the version that stripped him of every penny he had ever hidden. If you've enjoyed this journey of ultimate revenge and want to see how Sienna builds her new world without the shadows of men, make sure to subscribe and watch the next series, because the Queen is just getting started. The room was finally quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic hum of the city she now owned, and Sienna picked up the locket from the table, looking at it one last time before dropping it into the trash can. She didn't need a tracking chip or a hidden room to know who she was anymore. She was Sienna Sterling, the architect of her own destiny, and she had a world to run.